Hello everyone. Firstly, thank you to Sasha and the organisers for inviting me. I'll be speaking on behalf of myself and Brendan O'Connor today. Brendan sends his apologies that he couldn't make it. My talk, or our talk, follows on quite neatly from what Jen was just saying, because in being approached to talk about elite mobility and funerary practices in early Iron Age Europe, when you look at the British evidence, we have basically nothing to contribute on this front. I'm going to somehow stretch this limited data out over the next 20 minutes, basically posing the question of where are all the elites in Britain, and we use this opportunity to also update the corpus of Hallstatt C metalwork from Britain, and in many ways link back with the symposium from 2015 and look at connections between different regions as a way of getting some insights into elite practice in Britain at this time. We have next to no burials from Britain, and certainly no sense of regularity. It's very limited in late Bronze Age Hallstatt B in Britain, and it gets even more limited once you cross that sort of 800 BC boundary. There are, of course, issues with the Hallstatt Plateau at this point, and we are probably also facing a problem of lack of radiocarbon dates. So a recent discovery from a site in Dorset of 3 or 4 inhumations of teenagers showing absolutely no structure to the burial, buried in a pit, no grave goods, very much considered to be late Iron Age, and when they were radiocarbon dated, they produced a date in the 800 to 550 Cal BC. And similarly, at Ralston in West Yorkshire, an antiquarian discovery of a log coffin burial looked very much like either an early Bronze Age burial or an early medieval burial, and it came back with this date falling over the Hallstatt C period. So we are, and those are the only 2 very neatly dated burials from all of Britain. There's a little bit of evidence that there's some use of earlier stone monuments at this time, with radiocarbon dates of deposits there, but we still have no burials. And I present us here partly for Sasha's benefit, but also as an example of everything we don't have from Britain. We have no grave goods associated with any of these burials. We have no clearly datable pottery. We certainly have no wagons. We have fragments of horse tack. We have 1 Mindelheim sword from Linfar hoard itself, and a selection of other bronze swords. And we're essentially dealing with the invisible dead. We know people must have been living at this time, but we just don't know where they're dying. So how do we approach this? With no clearly datable pottery and settlement sites that are hampered by Hallstatt Plateau dates, which give you a 400-500 year range, we're left pretty much on to deal with typochronological data in terms of the metalwork sequences from this period. And here is basically a synchronization of chronology from Britain at this time from Brendan's paper in 2007. And over the course of this talk, I'm going to present various bits of evidence that derive from this period in Britain that links up with some of the elite material that you would expect to find in graves elsewhere. So I'll look into swords and shapes, razors, vessels. But I'm going to start with some of the most prolific evidence that we have at this time, which is hoarding data. Metal detecting in the last 20 years has greatly amplified our knowledge of hoarding at this time. So since Brendan did his roundup in 2007, we've had 17 new hoards, nearly doubling the total of known hoards. They almost entirely, let's see, will this work? They almost entirely concentrate around existing distribution patterns in the Wessex region of southern central Britain. they're overwhelmingly axes, but occasionally you have mixtures of ornaments, tools, one or two iron objects, and various casting pieces. And I should say we have no gold from this period in Britain at this time. The overall character shows a general, whilst the overall character can be classed within being predominantly axes, there's a surprising amount of difference and variation that's starting to emerge. So I show here a hoard from the Vale of Wardour, which was found about 10 years ago or so, and it's 114 objects. The latest objects dating within the Llynfar period, comprising Sompting and linear faceted axes, but it also contains objects from the early, middle and late Bronze Age. So it's 114 objects spanning many centuries of different object production. And it's not the only one. We have a couple of these so-called multi-period hoards, suggesting that there are various accumulation and collection practices going on at this time, clearly being coordinated in some way. But very close to this, the discovery of this hoard was another hoard which I don't have a picture of, but it comprised mostly iron objects and copper alloy objects, all of which can be securely dated within the Llynfar period. So there's not only the collection of the older material being deposited, but also the deposition of contemporary material. And we also have some quite substantial deposits, or substantial for Britain anyway, in the form of, here you see the Langton Matravers hoard, which is about 400 complete axes and a further 400 fragments, all linear faceted axes deposited across 4 pits. Almost all of them are in an as cast condition, and I'll come back to this point in a bit. But essentially, what we're seeing to a large degree is variability within these localized regions, suggesting different practices of selection and deposition going on, completely contrasting this idea of a collapse in the bronze industry at 800 BC. New discoveries and new research are also highlighting hoards from outside of this kind of central southern England area. On the left, you see a hoard from Ulverston in Cumbria, a collection of Sompting axes buried with a bit of casting waste found by a metal detector from Scotland, and very northerly in Scotland. We have the only hoard that securely dates to this period, from a site called Poolew. This is a find from 1877, recovered from a bog, comprising mostly Sompting axes, but also a fragment of a vessel and a much earlier bronze cup-ended ornament, and a radiocarbon date from one of the wooden hearths. Put this in the early 8th century BC. And lastly, I mentioned a new find from Stockbury, Kent, you see in the bottom right here. And this is the only hoard so far that falls within where you would expect a late Bronze Age hoard to show up. The dense concentration of hoards in southeastern England that you see during the Ewart Park Carp's Tongue phase is we have almost no hoards that date to the Llynfar period in that area, and in fact, this concentration that we have in the central southern Wessex period is an area where we have almost no hoards from the late Bronze Age either, and yet. So what we see is almost a reverse in these distribution patterns and a shift in how different regions were expressing themselves through hoarding. These new discoveries are also highlighting that fragmentation and the inclusion of casting waste is much more prolific than previously thought. And the reason I go into this detail of around hoarding is because what it seems to suggest is actually an extension, albeit in a different way, of late Bronze Age hoarding practices. You've still got the gathering of axes, you've still got the fragmentation of different material, although it's happening in different regions. but it's in contrast with some of the practices that are happening on continental Europe, and it goes to emphasize that not only are we seeing differences in burial practices at this time in Britain, but also shifts in hoarding, which are possibly linked in some way. I mentioned that we're seeing greater amounts of fragmentation, and thinking off the back of work by Sasha and others, we can also think about how many of these objects are actually being dismantled, and are there degrees of pars pro toto involved in depositions in Britain at this time. These are aspects that are considered important for Hallstatt C burial practices in the Low Countries and Central Europe, particularly in relation to horse gear. Are we potentially looking at similar acts? We should be aware that, at the point that's already been made, we are not actually looking at the entire set of horse tack, even when some of these objects look complete. And we have, from the Stockbury hoard, first evidence of false twisted horse bits from Britain, which tie in with, for instance, the Weichen bits from the Netherlands. And are we looking at similar sorts of elite culture, like popping up in different parts of Britain, but not being included into burials, because essentially that wasn't the done thing. You know, this wasn't the way that people express themselves, but it still gives us a hint that there is a connection across the channel at this time. I've mentioned axes already, but it's worth noting here a recent survey by Dot Borton, who highlighted 1,400 hoarded and single finds of axes from the Llenfar period in Britain, and the date from Pouliou that places deposition of Sompting axes around 800 to 750 BC gives quite a neat early origin for the production and deposition of Sompting types, but we know they must continue throughout this period. And recent radiocarbon dates from a midden site at Llanmaes in South Wales found dates spanning the Hallstatt C, Hallstatt D border, associated with fragments of Sompting and Armorican axes, and this seems consistent with Jose Gomez's suggestion that Armorican axes might date a bit later, though there's clearly evidence that they were at least a little bit earlier in Britain. And all of this ties into acts of conspicuous consumption. We see elite burials, as already mentioned, as this form of kind of conspicuous gathering and deposition. And we know that at this time, axes were being produced en masse. And for a long time, they've been considered either as ingots or as abandoned material. But here you see a close-up of some of the axes from the Langton Matravers deposit, which is 800 axes and axe fragments, all produced from a high tin, high lead, bronze, completely impractical. It seems they were all produced from clay molds and then immediately buried in pits. You see similar things with the Gestingen axes and also Armorican axes in northern France, where they're being produced on huge scale. And I think it's really difficult to argue that these are anything other than symbolic forms of production and consumption. How exactly they're being coordinated and why is a very difficult question to answer, but it suggests that there is still this obsession in the Hallstatt C period, certainly in Britain, of doing these big acts of consumption that may be communal activities, or they may be controlled by an elite few. Eugene has set me up quite nicely on for this slide in talking about the origins of swords and shapes at this time. And you see here Pierre Milson's map from 2004, where he, as well as others subsequently, have argued that many of the early Hallstatt C types derive their inspiration from Europe Park and Thames type swords, and these very much seem to be deriving from an Atlantic sphere of influence, moving east and adopted in parts of Central Europe, and certainly some of the later forms seem to be influenced by these Atlantic developments. We can think of the Buchenbach or Wangringen types, and also metal detecting is, whilst metal detecting has yet to show up any new swords, is throwing up more and more shapes and these characteristic wing-shaped shapes in new regions, and this evidence that's been more and more established over the last 15 years reverses the traditional direction of influence in the early Hallstatt period. But inevitably raises various questions about why warriors and elites in Central Europe reverted to these older leaf-shaped forms, and also whilst this evidence must suggest that people, or at least ideas, are moving backwards and forwards across these regions. And by the end of the Hallstatt C period, there seems to be no adoption of some of the Central European swords that were produced, such as Mindelheim. And this example from Lindfar, as I already mentioned, is the only, certainly the only iron sword and the only Mindelheim sword from Britain, and is almost certainly an import. This Atlantic network is also emphasized by the variation of razors that are increasingly discovered. However, we mostly lack any associations for them. They're all single metal detective finds, but as with the hoards, these continue to be made more and more often, contributing to wider and wider distribution patterns across the Thames Valley and central southern England region. So whilst 10 years ago we only had 11, we now have nearly 30, and they take a variety of forms, and they clearly tap into what's going on the other side of the channel as well. And lastly, I want to mention vessels which we're increasingly gaining radiocarbon dates in association with that are showing their very early use. At Broome, we have fragments from a cremation pyre site that spans 830 to 520 Cal BC. And at Llanmaes, we have another late, relatively late date for these, almost exclusively Class B2 vessels, which confirms Sabina Gerloff's suggestion that they have some overlap with earlier Class B1. But we have very, very few that are complete. There's nice cauldrons from Sompting and from Lindfar itself, but we have no buckets and certainly no situlae. So nothing, again, that you would particularly consider elite. And it's also quite noticeable that many of these are being dismantled and fragmented and occurring in hoards and at midden sites. So I don't have an answer. Where are all the elites? We have no recognisably elite culture during this period in Britain, but it's tempting to follow an argument made by Pierre-Yves Milson, in that he suggests that we don't necessarily see the emergence of an elite culture in Hallstatt C, but rather they become archaeologically visible to us. So is this a result of practices not adopted? And what we see in Britain is simply no preoccupation with venerating elites in these grand burials. They like what they were doing and they continue doing it in more or less the same way. And because there's no change in burial practices and there's a continuation in hoarding practices, we have no elite culture that emerges at this time. Nonetheless, we have evidence that there are continued connections with continental Europe, certainly through these Atlantic networks of things like swords, shapes, and razors. So people in Britain weren't unaware of what was happening, although there is this does diminish over the 7th century, and by the 6th and 5th centuries, Hallstatt D, we have basically no evidence of what's going on in Britain at this time. Nonetheless, we know that new forms of objects were emerging. We know that settlements were in quite continued long use, and this runs contrary to the narrative of the collapse in the bronze industry. So I hope what I've shown is that by tapping into some of these elements of practice and certainly with the increasing new discoveries, we do get to see glimpses of elite culture and a connected elite culture in Britain at this time. But I think we are always going to be faced with the question of the missing elites in Britain. And on that note, I want to say thank you for listening, and thank you again to the organisers for inviting us.